The first rule, which is kind of a comical rule, is stand up straight with your shoulders back. And it's a meditation, among other things, on the habits of lobsters. I read some papers on lobsters about, must be 10 years ago, I guess, and they just absolutely blew me away. And one of the things I've really loved about being a psychologist, and there's many things, but I've really loved psychoanalytic theory and the great clinicians, the behaviorists as well. I mean, Freud, Jung, Adler, Carl Rogers, Abraham Maslow, the behaviorists like Skinner and the cognitive behaviorists. I mean, I've learned a tremendous amount from reading the clinicians. And so if any of you are interested in psychology, I would really recommend reading the great clinicians, because you learn so much about life. It's crazy by reading them. So that's been fun. But then on the entirely other end of the spectrum, where I've learned most about psychology, is from the really low, what would you call them, the really science-oriented animal behaviorists. That's where they turned into the neuroscientists, right? They were the animal behaviorists first of all, and then they turned into the neuroscientists. And I've learned a tremendous amount from them. They're such clear thinkers. The best of the bunch, I think, there's two of them. One named Jeffrey Gray, who wrote a book called The Neuropsychology of Anxiety, which is just a deadly book. It's impossible to read. It takes like 6 months to read it, because I think he read like 1,800 papers to write it or something like that. And he actually read them. That's the cool thing. And he understood them, which is really something. And then there's another guy named Jaak Panksepp, who wrote a book called Affective Neuroscience, which outlines his studies, for example, of rats. He was the guy who learned that rats laugh if you tickle them with the end of a pencil eraser, but they laugh ultrasonically like bats. So you have to slow down the ultrasonic vocalization before you can hear them giggle. And you'd think, why the hell would you spend your time tickling rats with a pencil and making them laugh? But see, what he demonstrated there was that there was a play circuit in mammals, that there's a psychobiological basis for rough and tumble play, for example. It's a bloody big deal, you know, discovering a whole new circuit in the brain. That's like discovering a continent. It's Nobel Prize winning stuff. And Panksepp's Affective Neuroscience, I would highly recommend that. So there's this other book I know about too, which is 12 Rules for Life, which you could also look into if you want. Anyways, I was reading these articles on lobsters, and I came across this finding that lobsters govern their postural flexion with serotonin. And I thought, God, that's so interesting. It's so flexion is to stand up straight. Eh? I thought, wow, that's so interesting, because, you know, depressed people crouch over. I wonder if there's any link between those two things. And then I went and read a whole pile of papers on lobster and lobster neurochemistry. Lobster neurochemistry is actually quite well understood, because they have a fairly simple nervous system, right? And so if you want to understand a complex nervous system, it's a good idea to understand a simple one first and then sort of elaborate upwards. And it turns out that serotonin governs status, emotional regulation, and posture in lobsters, just like it does in human beings. And so that just blew me away. And so one thing that chapter 1 is about is the fact that if a lobster is defeated in a dominance battle, you can give it essentially antidepressants and it will fight again. And that just blew me away. You know, it's so remarkable, because one of the things it tells you is that, so if you're imagine that you could be lobster top dog or bottom dog. Imagine there's 10 strata in the lobster hierarchy. So you could be number 1, right, top lobster, number 10, bottom lobster. If you're bottom lobster, you have low serotonin levels and high octopamine levels. That's a neurochemical that human beings don't produce. And if you're a top lobster, you have high serotonin levels and low octopamine levels. And you can move a lobster in its dominance hierarchy by moderating its levels of serotonin. And I thought, that's so interesting, because what it means is that the counter that keeps track of our status, and we have a counter in a sense in our minds that keeps track of our status, is 1/3 of a billion years old. And what that also means is that the idea of the hierarchy, let's call it a dominance hierarchy, because within lobsters it's kind of like a physical prowess hierarchy, something like that. The idea of the hierarchy is at least 350 million years old. And so I read that and I think, well, so much for the idea that human hierarchies are a sociocultural construct. It's like, no, that's wrong. It's not just a little bit wrong, it's unbelievably wrong. It's mind-bogglingly wrong, right? And it's